We are here as part of our global leadership series where we are speaking to senior foreign policy officials around the world. And we're very happy to welcome today Jens Spahn, who is a shining and rising star in German politics and is currently the German health minister. Before I introduce Mr. Spahn, I would like to thank the Aspen Institute Germany and the German Embassy, both of which helped to advertise this event. And we have a very large group of people here in the audience. We're very grateful to you all for joining us on this Thanksgiving week and this very busy week in American politics. As always, if we're gonna, Mr. Spahn is gonna give some short introductory remarks, then he and I will have a conversation. And then later in the hour, we will turn it to open audience Q&A. So if you do have a question, please press the participants button at the bottom of your screen and then use the raise hand function and I'll call on you and you can come up live and ask your question. Germany, of course, is a shining example of government policy working effectively to get the coronavirus under control. We have a lot to learn from Germany. And of course, one of America's closest partners in Europe and around the world. There's no one better to discuss both of those things than Jens Spahn, who is a CDU politician, rising star in the party. He was sworn in as Federal Minister of Health in 2018, and he is a member of the Christian Democratic Union of Germany, the center-right party, which currently governs in partnership with the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany. Mr. Spahn was first elected to the German Bundestag in 2002, as I think the youngest member ever to be elected by the CDU. And he represents Steinfurt-Borken, not so far from where I grew up. Previously, he also served as health policy spokesperson for the CDU-CSU parliamentary group. And in 2012, he became a member of the Federal Executive Committee of the CDU. He's also the editor of a book about Germany and immigration and the big wave of refugees that happened in Germany a few years ago. And then also with two physicians, he wrote the book, The App from Your Doctor, about digital medicine. He lives in Berlin with his partner. Mr. Spahn, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. We know you're busy with the second coronavirus surge that's hitting Germany as well as us. And we're hoping to hear from you some opening remarks, both on the pandemic, but also how the pandemic is functioning as a catalyst for an updated German foreign policy. So with that, why don't I let you begin? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Anja, for this kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for being with us. Actually, focusing on just shortly on the current situation, it is the case, as you just mentioned, we are in the middle of the second wave. For the second time, we made it to actually break the wave, to stop the exponential growth. I would say in a comparably early status compared to many of our neighboring countries, but still numbers are high, too high to relax. And so just as of tomorrow, we will have another discussion with the prime ministers of the 16 federal states. In a federal state like Germany, that's a bit different to France, for example, as a central state. We always need to coordinate, but in result, that's at least my impression, we are stronger together with all these 17 national state, 16 federal states, 17 different players acting in this. So I'm quite optimistic in general, at least. I don't know if it takes 1 week longer or less long, but nevertheless, that we will make it this time again to get the virus back under control. And by the way, there's a silver stripe on the horizon with the vaccine, actually, perhaps even coming already in December. It's not too sure, if not at the beginning of next year. Of course, I'm kind of proud as a German health minister that 3 candidates, especially 2 of the very promising ones, BioNTech and CureVac, are being developed here in Germany. Together, by the way, BioNTech, Pfizer, with a US partner. So for this hardship that we all suffer these days, and many people in Germany and Europe in this pandemic situation, at the same time at least, and that might make it easier, this hardship, to get through it, we see a silver stripe, and that is a good news. But at the same time, and that brings me to the second topic, we definitely need to discuss what will be the long-lasting results of this pandemic. And I mean, it's the beginning of a new decade, the 20s, this pandemic at the beginning of it, and I'm very sure it will be there for the rest of the decade, just by the way it shaped it from the beginning, and brought issues up as a catalyst, as I just said, issues up that were already there before, but now are there much more, it can be seen much clearer, I would say, and especially that counts for foreign policy, and I will focus on that one. There are many other areas to touch, but I will touch that one now. For Germany, it was already clear before COVID-19 that our success model that rests on two pillars, the Pax Americana and the benign global market. We make money while you secure us, in short. That doesn't work anymore. And that was already clear before COVID-19, but COVID-19 made it even clearer that Europe and the European Union has to become more sovereign, to become actually more capable to really act for itself and for its neighborhood, for example, to be strong enough to get through a crisis like this, a health crisis, but for other crises as well. There was a US turning inward and more toward the Pacific and a global market. Actually, was a China that is very aggressive when it comes to intellectual property and other areas. So this German business model for sure doesn't work in the 20s as it did before. And by the way, with Joe Biden becoming the next president and the Democrats in power, I'm not too sure that the general approach towards trade, China, NATO will change. So the issue remains for sure. That means that we have to create a more proactive, strong state at German European level in economic affairs. I'm very sure that German and European companies, if they really want to be world league, competing with US and Chinese companies, they do need the support of the state. For example, by antitrust laws that make it possible to have a real European player. With the antitrust laws we have right now in Europe, just take the Siemens-Alstom case, the merger that didn't work because of the antitrust regulation we have right now. As long as that is the case, that we can't create big European players with world league class, we don't have any chance. Competing with Chinese companies very much supported by the state, if they are not the state themselves, more or less, and with the big, especially tech companies we see in the US. The same counts for trade. We really have suffered from being too dependent from China in two regards, by the way. Products coming from China, APIs for drugs, protective masks for our healthcare workers, and the other way around for exports. The German car manufacturing industry actually was not in a lockdown because of political decisions. They decided to stop producing for weeks because it was not a good time to sell cars to China. There was no market anymore. And we are so depending on China in these two ways. We knew that before, but this crisis made that very clear, that we need to diversify, that we need to have more trade agreements with other regions of the world, and that the Mercosur trade agreement between South America and the EU actually is on hold, more or less, right now politically, is not a good signal in this. And while at the same time, the Asian region, by the way, is having the biggest trade agreement ever. A second issue, of course, is a more proactive, strong state in defense and security matters. That issue was there before the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis as well. So it's about strengthening resilience here in Germany. We have a debate ongoing, of course, how much we want to spend for defense and security, but especially with the developments we've seen with the Crimea area, Ukraine, Belarus, Germans and Europeans more and more realize, I mean, Moscow is 2 hours by plane away from Berlin, where I am here now, do realize that the 20s will be different to what we especially have seen in 10 or 15 years ago. For really keeping peace here in Europe, we need to we need to meet our standards, and our capability must meet them. Just an example, the Balkan region, something like Milosevic, Serbia 20 years ago, without the help of the US, we are still not able, that's just the case, that's the truth, we would not be able to manage that one and deal with it from a security and military perspective. And so we need to become more adult, actually, in this regard, Germany and the European Union within the NATO. It's strengthening the NATO if the NATO has a strong European pillar, and that is what it is about. It's not opposing NATO, it's being a part of a NATO, and that is about global burden sharing, actually, and that is a discussion we need to have. These both examples make very clear that we, at the same time, need to convince German voters. They don't like these issues too much yet. It's largely that many of the people are unaware of these challenges and this change, actually, in the global circumstances for our business model. And there is the risk, of course, to have a split. There is the national approach, more and more national interest, nationalism even increasing in some regards, emphasizing national interest. And at the same time, we have the left-wing pacifism. And both sides actually don't like the idea of more multilateral and more international engagement. And actually, we need to have a proper foreign policy debate in Germany and Europe that is not dividing, but uniting. And the only key I see for that is really the European Union to make clear that it is in our national interest, so that's for the right wing, I would say, in our national interest to leverage our power through international organizations, and at the same time for the left wing, of course, multilateralism and cooperating, especially on the European level, is a good narrative too. So it's about bringing these different narratives together to one, to convince voters, and at the same time to convince our European partners. And that is my last point. Everyone calls for German leadership. That's new to us, new to Europe regarding our history. But at the same time, once we are leading, it's not always honored either. When it comes to the Eurozone, migration, other issues, of course, the biggest brother in the room, that's always, I mean, I'm the oldest too in our family, is always asked, of course, to lead. But at the same time, he should not become too strong. And by the way, out of this pandemic economic crisis in France, of course, there is already a debate ongoing. If once again, after a crisis, Germany gets out economically stronger than France again, and that this divide within Europe between the economies is even increasing, which would be causing a real big problem. So actually, we need to convince voters, because a foreign policy should always be something that is uniting, not dividing. Otherwise, you just have no room for maneuver. You can see that in many countries, in Europe as well. And at the same time, taking a leading role in Europe, we need to keep Europe together to find the right balance between leading and compromising in some regards. That is something that really needs a proper debate, a debate we don't see too often in Germany and perhaps in other political arenas worldwide. And so actually, I just want to focus on that one too. And if you ask why the health minister, I can just give you a very concrete example. The WHO, the World Health Organization, is just one of these multilateral organizations through which we could leverage our interest. And that is why we are very much engaged as Germany within the WHO. And at the same time, we can be stronger together if we let the WHO be strong. it can only be as good as the member states let it be. And that is something I really do hope will be changing in the US policy with the new president, that they stay in. It needs reform, but we can make a difference together in there.
Thank you very much. That was a great opening and gives us a huge amount to talk about. So maybe I'll start off by asking you one or two questions about the pandemic specifically, and then we'll broaden into all of the other subjects that you touched on and then open to our audience. Now, Germany has been an enormous success story fighting the pandemic, and frankly, we're all envious. Germany's per capita death rate is something, as of last night, 17 per 100,000 population, compared to in the US, where it's 78 per 100,000, and in the UK, 82 per 100,000. So very advanced economies, very different outcome. And in addition to having a good health outcome, you managed to do something that's still really contentious here in the US, and that is you opened your schools again, starting in May. And most German kids are actively going to school. So could you explain a little bit what strategies guided your early success? And then can you maybe also say a specific word about education and schooling and how you're managing to keep these schools open without furthering the spread?
Well, first of all, I would always say we were lucky too. So that makes me kind of humble and grateful, not overconfident. Lucky, why? Because actually, especially in spring, Italy was hit first, hardly hit. And of course, that woke us all up to act proactively and precautiously. And at the same time, we just invested a lot in our healthcare system. Traditionally, it's a big tradition in Germany. We have more ICU capacities, or we had in summer more ICU capacities and beds empty than France and Italy have altogether at all. And so that shows actually that we can rely on a very strong healthcare system, 5 million people working on it, well skilled, and that was and still is very helpful in this crisis. And I would say that's another lesson learned nationally by this crisis, that we do appreciate this healthcare system we have more than even before. And this part of the social state, social welfare state, a part that protects and gives security, that actually will play a dominant role in the social debate of the 20s. I'm very sure more investments in the healthcare system. So that actually helped a lot, but most of all, it's just the people. I always say you can't actually by laws or regulation or by enforcing it, you can't reach what you need to reach. That most citizens, that almost all citizens want to protect each other, want to make a difference, want to wear masks, though it is not very comfortable. And that is what we see Germans. I can't say it for other countries. I just can say I'm very grateful that my fellow citizens are really in a big majority applying to the rules needed to protect each other, just voluntarily. And that is the biggest step actually to success from my point of view. Schools and kindergarten, we made very clear, whatever happens, whatever wave might come after the first one, not again closing kindergartens and schools that long. It's hardship for parents, it's hardship for children. It has a social dimension, by the way, especially for those children that don't have parents that really can teach them language-wise, whatever. So it's a very, very social dimension too. And so our motto from the beginning after the first wave was, kindergartens and schools are the last ones to close again, whatever happens. And meanwhile, we do have evidence, by the way, that the under 12, under 14 years old are part of the pandemic durchschnittlich, average, in an under average way. So actually it just starts with 12, 13, 14 years old that they begin to play an average or even an overrated role in this pandemic and infectious development. But the younger children actually are not spreading it, and that is different to other viruses. And with all this, we so far made the approach, we might close down restaurants and other areas, but schools and kindergartens will be the last ones. And so far, we luckily could make that possible.
Thank you. Working women around the world salute you.
By the way, that is very interesting. Comparing the last pandemic, the Spanish flu, you have to see back then family structures were very different. And of course, closing of schools and kindergartens had a different impact on families and society as it had today. This is the first pandemic in this complex, modern world. And that makes it very much different from the social structure and the family structure we have to the Spanish flu 100 years ago.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let me ask a follow-up question, and that's about the German economy. So it's been hard hit like the rest of Europe, like the US. I saw in an article I read last night that overall it will probably shrink 4% or a little more than 4% this year, and then rebound. And of course, your strategy was very different from what we used in the US, where people were out of jobs and then thrown on the unemployment rolls. Germany had a big emphasis on keeping people in jobs and paying the salaries. How is that going? Has it been enormously expensive? Are you finding that it worked? And how are you going to sustain that through this second wave that we're seeing now?
Well, actually, that's a lesson learned from the financial crisis 10 years ago, where we used this instrument that we call Kurzarbeitergeld, which means that you get a social welfare. While you are keeping your job, you get a kind of a salary by the state, and your employer is supported through this. And the idea is actually, in a time of crisis by external shocks, that people, well-skilled people mostly, can stay with their company, and at the same time the company, as soon as it can come back on track, as soon as there are new orders and new work to do, immediately can start, because the people are still there, especially the skilled people. And that worked very well 10 years ago. This time it's different, it's longer, much longer, that we need this tool, and it's a very expensive one, as you just mentioned. During the summer, we saw many areas of our industry restarting. So actually the numbers of people getting this Kurzarbeitergeld was declining. Now it's a bit back up. But what we said from the beginning, it's in the end, if you take it on the long run, it's less expensive to spend more now, but to keep people having their jobs, than having a high rate of unemployment, and then the companies need even longer to restart. That, of course, only works if you get more or less a V, that economy down and up again. Perhaps not like this, more like this, but only then it works. You can't do this for years, that's for sure. But we want to build a bridge into the next year for our people, and that gives security in a crisis, and is very important.
Yeah, it's interesting because what we're seeing here in the US is what Larry Summers has actually called at one of these Aspen Strategy meetings, a K-shaped recovery, where those who work in tech and finance, kind of at the bottom of the income scale, are bouncing back just fine or never had a problem. And those at the bottom, especially in the service sector, restaurants, hospitality, have been laid off and are really struggling. Do you see a similar effect in Germany, or less so?
Definitely, of course. I mean, all these areas, especially in Berlin. I mean, Berlin is the party and event city of Europe. And of course, all these venues are closed now, and that are more or less jobs that are not long-term. Many of them are, well, I don't know, students paid on a lower level. So of course, and that brings another social dimension to this crisis. Of course, many of them struggle right now, and it's different to other areas. I mean, we do see both, as you just described. We have areas where there was and still is a real increase in the turnover, and that have more to do, more work than ever. And at the same time, we have areas really almost back to zero, with hotels closed, restaurants closed, the event scene down, party scene down, culture, cinemas. Of course, we do have those too, but at the same time, we are not just having the social benefit system for employees. We do have the same for these small enterprises or small companies, to building bridges for them too. But again, that's very expensive. We only can do that for some months, and so we really need to be back in 2021. By the way, before this, I was State Secretary for the Budget with Wolfgang Schäuble in the Finance Ministry, and I had to defend our Black Zero, making no new debt. Every time I was in Washington, every time I was in DC or in New York or in London or Brussels, wherever, people just said, you, Germany, you could spend more, do more, it's very cheap for you to get money, make that. And we said, no, in good times, we want to increase our resilience. We want to make known, actually it's Keynes in its best way. We want to keep debts down, to actually build up resilience for bad times. And now we do have economically bad times, and now we really have the room for maneuver to act and to make a difference for innovation, for investments, but for public, for domestic and public demand back home too in this crisis.
Thank you. One quick clarifying, are the folks in your hospitality and events business also part of Kurzarbeit? They also get part of their salary covered by the state?
Yes.
Yeah, very helpful. Let me turn to the optimistic light at the end of the tunnel that everyone is talking about now, and a great example of German-US partnership, Pfizer in cooperation with BioNTech and several others, AstraZeneca and Oxford, Johnson & Johnson is about to come out, Moderna. We see vaccines happening at record speed. All are reportedly effective in stopping the virus. We haven't heard yet if they're effective once you're immunized to stop you from spreading the virus to others, or how long you'll have immunity. And of course, the big question mark here in the US is how quickly are we going to get this cold chain up and running, cold supply chain, and how quickly will we get it rolled out? So can I ask you first how Germany is doing on that front, and then let's move to how that looks on the international scene.
Well, of course, it's the same here. It's a very, I mean, especially with this temperature of minus 70 degrees Celsius, it's very challenging to build up the logistic chain that you need for this. At the same time, together with the 16 federal states and their administrative structure they have on the ground, I'm very optimistic actually that we can manage this. Once we do have AstraZeneca or Moderna or even CureVac or Johnson & Johnson, these vaccines can be there on a much higher temperature, even on a fridge temperature, some of them. So that's the normal procedure. And just right now, these days, German general practitioners are vaccinating around 20 million, so a fourth of our population, 20 million people here in Germany with a flu vaccine. So actually the system shows every year that it is capable to vaccinate millions of people every year. So once we have a vaccine that is really by the way, especially the logistic can work, is really easier to handle. And most of the vaccines, it's a bit unlucky. I mean, I'm very happy that BioNTech is the first one, of course, but the first one is the most difficult one to handle for logistics. The other ones will be easier, and as soon as they are available, we will change step by step to do it the normal way through general practitioners. And so I'm actually very optimistic. Once there are these vaccines available, we will manage to vaccinate as many people as want to be vaccinated.
Mm-hmm. And the question, of course, on everyone's lips is when. And in the US, we hear a combination of it'll be widely available Q2 through the end of the summer. How does that look in Germany?
Well, there is a good chance, but 50-50 that there might be the approval, first of all, mid of December. It will be later than in the US, by the way. That is more or less already for sure, because due to different procedures, actually, and different mechanisms that are there, but it's totally okay. I mean, 1 or 2 weeks. We have the same with every drug, more or less, that it is a bit earlier there or there. But I'm very optimistic around New Year. Shortly before or shortly after, we will have this vaccine. The first dose is available. Of course, from the beginning, not enough for everyone. So we need to prioritize vulnerable groups, the elderly, healthcare workers, and then step by step with a better availability, a bigger quantity of doses, we actually will move on to widen it up and step by step to vaccinate more and more people. But I mean, within 1 year, less 1 year, by just the finding of a new virus, to have a vaccine that's very unique. That is for sure the fastest procedure in human history, and that is something I find it really makes me optimistic, and is really good news for progress and for the for scientific approach, actually, to handle crisis.
It is. It's the most optimistic news we've heard in this very complex year. And let me ask you just one more question on this. How much of the German population, or here the US population, will need to be vaccinated before things go back to normal? Because you hear very different things, like I said before, about whether it just makes you immune or it actually prevents you from spreading it. And obviously, if it doesn't prevent you from spreading it, almost everyone needs to be vaccinated for the economy to bounce back.
Well, I mean, for measles, for example, are much more infectious than this one. Measles are more infectious. You can infect more people in a room much easier, but we do have a vaccine, and you need up to 95-98% of the people vaccinated or being immune to stop it. For this virus, they say it's 2/3 more or less, 60-65%. Of course, some are immune already because in the US more than in Germany, they have gone through it, and the others get vaccinated. And then it depends on the groups. I mean, if all vulnerable groups, the elderly and healthcare workers, are vaccinated with a high rate, 80 or 90%, then of course that already makes a difference. If you have the 20 years old not vaccinated at all, that's less difficult than the 80 years old not being vaccinated for the harm this virus can do to the elderly. So it's not easy to just give one figure that fits for all societies and all contexts, but I would say around 55-65% of the population.
Got it. That's very helpful. I just want to remind all of those attendees here on the Zoom that if you want to ask a question, we'll turn to questions in about 7 or 8 minutes. If you can please go to participants at the bottom and press the raise hand button. Herr Spahn, let us now zoom out. You talked a lot about Germany taking a bigger role, can't rely on the Pax Americana, must become stronger and more sovereign and more active in the world. You know, us American transatlanticists love to hear that. All of us who go to the Munich Security Conference and elsewhere. In fact, Wolfgang Ischinger, who runs the security conference, wrote in our book a month ago exactly this. Germany must step up and take its rightful place at the governing board of the world, and we welcome that. So let me start with one specific issue leading from the last one, and that is the international distribution of vaccines. So when you look at what's happened, the UK has bought enough doses for 300% of their population, the US over 200%, Germany about 300%, India 4%. Brazil, not so much. The rest of the developing world, not so much. COVAX and Gavi, of course, are trying to help, but we're not quite there yet. Does Germany have a role in stepping up and helping with this?
Of course we do have. First of all, for example, the approach we took in Europe, just to start with that one, because of course the European countries, the 27 member states, are in a very different economic and GDP position, for example, and in a different market position. France, Germany, if I had wanted, we would have get the contracts bilateral for Germany with Pfizer or with AstraZeneca too. But many of the 27 are just too small and not too important a market for these big pharma companies. That, of course, sooner or later, but I would say later, they would have get some too, but not in the first round. And that is why France, Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands at the very beginning in May or June said, well, let's build together an alliance that calls itself an inclusive alliance. We want to negotiate for all 27 to make sure that all 27, once there is a vaccine, get the same vaccine population rated at the same time. And then we made it together with the European Commission, and now that is the way it works. And of course, Germany, as I said, could have said no, the national way, but we made it clear from the very beginning we do it the European way to the benefit of all European citizens at the same time. That's the first step, Europe. And then internationally, we do have the COVAX facilities, the ACT accelerator, the initiatives by the WHO, Gavi, CEPI, all cooperating, working together. And of course, we are engaged financially, Germany, France, other countries, and Europe, the European Union itself. We are engaged with resources, human resources, for example, experts supporting it, and of course, by financing the research and production capacities, we make it available for the rest of the world too. I mean, that it is so quick is due to the big financial support the US and Europe have given to these companies. And once it is developed, of course, step by step, it is there for the rest of the world. And now it's about timing, fair timing. You know, I couldn't explain to the Germans that vaccination starts somewhere in the world, but not in Germany. But financed by us. I mean, vaccination financed by us in Africa, but no vaccination available in Germany is not something that gives you support for international cooperation back home. So you need to have a good timing that, of course, and I said we are one of the oldest societies in the world. We are very vulnerable. Niger has an average age of 15. In this pandemic, with this virus, the old countries, the European countries, are even more vulnerable in a certain way, in this regard at least, than the younger countries. So it makes sense to secure vaccines for Europe and for Germany, and at the same time we are engaged very much in these international projects to secure it for the world too. But that only can work together, otherwise we lose support back home.
Absolutely. Thank you. So zooming out even farther now, you know, one of the pillars of American foreign policy since the end of World War II has been a strong transatlantic relationship, and in particular at the center of that, a strong relationship with Germany, within NATO and within the EU. We have a new president-elect, Joe Biden, his administration that we're seeing fill out so far with a lot of transatlanticists. What do you think on the European side and on the German side, what openings are there to reinvigorate the relationship between Berlin and Washington?
Well, first of all, very generally, and I already touched that, the way Germany is seen and the role of Germany by the US and by our European partners really has changed. Remember when the NATO was founded, Lord Ismay, the first General Secretary, said the NATO is there to keep the US in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. The approach was obviously a different one to demanding the Germans to take a leading role in some regards, especially in security and military regards. So this is new for us, and we still need to adapt to it in our public debate back home here, how we debate foreign issues and security issues, and by realizing, I mean, the security of Europe and the European Union can't be done by the Luxembourg army. Obviously, it needs to be done, especially by France, Germany, Italy. I would even say in a strong cooperation with the UK. That is an area where I, from the very beginning, would love the UK to be a very close ally and partner, perhaps through to a European Security Council, for example, to have a structured way of coordinating security issues with the UK. And then within the Transatlantic partnership, a Europe that is able and capable militarily and politically and by all resources to secure its own neighborhood. East Europe, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Middle East, Turkey, Balkan, Northern Africa. I would say that's already enough actually to begin with, to become capable of. We don't need military cruise ships of Europe in the Pacific. I don't see that. On the Chinese Sea, there are debates if there should be Germany engaged in the Chinese Sea. I would be happy enough if we were able to manage the Baltic Sea actually first, and then we can debate the rest. And so for the NATO, the idea of global burden sharing would mean to me that we have a kind of agreement with the US that we as Europe become and desperately need to become capable to deal with our own neighborhood and to keep it stable and safe and peaceful. And at the same time, the US can more focus on the Pacific and the Pacific area. So it's a kind of burden sharing, not just in a way who pays for what, but the kind of burden sharing as well, who takes care of what region to remain stable and that there is peace. And that is a debate you only can have if you have a Europe that, again, this is the most important word, becoming capable. We are not capable enough. We do spend almost double as much as Russia, Germany and France together, and Italy and some others in defense spending. But if asked who is militarily stronger and who is able to project its power to other regions of the world, like Syria or the Middle East, Russia is able. Perhaps it's only a small part of what they are really able or not able to, but the projection is they are able. And the European Union is not. And that is really a big problem. And as I said, it's not solved by Luxembourg. We need to explain to our people that leadership means not just economically leadership.
Right. And that's always very difficult with the German public, as you already mentioned, on the far right and on the far left. But let me press you. Let me turn now to Lori Garrett, who is one of our great infectious disease experts in the United States. And I'll turn to Lori. And then after that, I'd like to just dig in a little bit deeper with you on two specifics. And that is German-US cooperation with respect to Russia, and then with respect to China, which you've only touched on.
And that all in 10 minutes.
Yeah, all in 10 minutes. We've got a lot to cover. Lori, are you there?
I am here, and thank you very much, Minister Spahn, for giving your time to us. I know it's late for you. And I have a quick question. It takes me a little bit of time to phrase it right. First of all, the Bloomberg organization runs what they call resilience scores for the COVID response and economic recovery, nation by nation. Germany receives a number 14 score, United States a number 18. And ahead of us, not only are most of Scandinavia, not Sweden notably, and Japan and Taiwan, but also countries like Thailand. So that it's not a list by wealth, by any means. It's a list by the nature of the response, which is interesting. And it also shows us, as you go down the list, many countries that you consider quite poor nations by GDP per capita are actually doing quite well in resilience measurement and in COVID response. So unlike past epidemics, we have not seen that the reaction and the capacity to deal with it is tightly linked with wealth and the relative wealth of a society. That's very interesting. It's unusual. And your Munich security group recently issued a long analysis of all of this, saying we have to stop thinking of this as a COVID pandemic, but as a polypandemic, talking about impact on development, impact on education, impact across multiple sectors of the world, and differentials in how societies are capable of bouncing back, not just against a disease, but against the polypandemic, as they phrase it. Can you talk to us a little about that?
Thank you.
Well, first of all, you're right. It's not by the nature of wealth or GDP, or by the nature of the response is one issue. It's different cultures regarding, I mean, the simple thing of wearing masks, for example, is obviously a different approach. But I would say it's by the nature of geography too. I mean, Germany is in the middle of a continent with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, people crossing our Danish, Dutch, Belgian, Luxembourgian, French, Swiss, Austrian, Czech, and Polish border every day, and by land border. And that's a bit different to be an island only reached by planes. If I only had planes coming in, it would be a bit easier to control it. That's not the only reason, but that's a difference too, just by geography. And by the nature of the demography too, by the way, as I just mentioned, the elderly are most hardest hit by this virus, and with a society, I mean, Japan, it has the same society as old as the Western European societies. It really can do a lot more harm than in others. But in general, what we see is, I mean, it's a competition of systems too. Of course, we have a debate if a system like the Chinese system, more autocratic, is more capable to deal with such a situation. And I think our Western world and our liberal democracies need to show that we are not as good, but even better in this. And so Taiwan and Japan actually are good examples. But islands, good examples too. And I would find it very interesting after this. Of course, we are now looking around and everyone has assumptions, as I just had, what might be the reason. But we really need to have a scientific approach and lessons learned developed out of it when this is over, to go deeper into it, not just move on, but to look back to learn why some were more successful than others by different reasons than you might think of, as you just mentioned.
Thank you, Herr Spahn. Let me follow up on the previous conversation we were starting, and let me press you a little bit on Russia. So Americans would say, great, we really want Germany and Europe to step up. And many Americans see one of the biggest threats to peace and security in Europe, Russia and the meddling in Ukraine, what's happening in Belarus and elsewhere, you know it well. And then you see Germany still finishing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which has become a real sticking point, including, as you know, in US legislation. What would you say to those Americans?
Well, it's obviously an ongoing debate in Germany, Europe, within the Transatlantic Partnership. It's complex, definitely. And it's not just, I mean, there are some in Germany saying it's only an economic issue with the company and its planning permissions. Of course it is not. It's a political issue in many regards. It's about, of course, dependency, but both sides. I mean, this creates dependencies on both sides of the stream, more or less. And of course, we need to adapt to developments in several regards. I mean, it's about having a secure supply as well of engines and then power and then gas. and at the same time, the relation with Russia, especially for Germany, if you take history, is a very complex one. It's always easy, frankly spoken, it's easy to be in DC, a big sea between you and Russia, and only reachable by airplane or perhaps by ship, or if it is just some hours away, on the land side. And so we need, with all the struggles that are there and all the difficult developments we have seen in the past years, I was already almost in parliament when President Putin gave his speech in the German Bundestag 20 years ago in German, most parts of it. That was a different Putin and a different Russia, for sure. But for us, for Germany and for the whole of Europe, it's a bit more complex, let me put it that way, and then it might look like from far away. And so I just can ask you for some more patience in this debate.
Understood. Absolutely. And on China, it's actually interesting. As we're speaking, there's an email correspondence going on with a group of Germans who want to meet with me, other Americans, other Europeans to discuss China. This is new. I would say even 2-3 years ago, most of what I heard from my German and European friends was, well, if Trump's going to start a trade war, we'll be happy to trade with China. That's flip, of course, but it was along those lines. And more recently, many Europeans who are close to the foreign policy world are sitting up and taking notice and saying, well, maybe this isn't all just an economic opportunity. And you said very clearly that you don't want German or European ships patrolling the South China Sea. Understood. But what more can the US and Europe to work together to manage appropriately the rise of China?
You know what I was thinking of a lot in the past years, that content-wise or policy-wise, many of the approaches the Trump administration had actually were the same kind of as we had. Of course, we do have issues with China. Intellectual property, trade issues, aluminium, steel, solar panels, many, and then Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, human rights issues. And actually, I would have loved if we had merged our powers and strengthened this. Instead, we have had an internal fight between the trade fight or trade struggle between the US and Europe. If we had TTIP and tried to get other regions of the world in, we would have been the standard setters of the world. Now there's a big risk that the new Asian trade agreement will be the standard setter of the 20s and the 30s. And actually, that is really worrying me. And so the first step for merging our political and economic powers towards China transatlantically, the first step would be to finally find our own trade agreement together. And I very much, and both sides have done their mistakes in this. I mean, I remember very well the debate back here in Germany about TTIP. And clawed chicken and all these stupid debates we had back then. So I really hope that this is a push, a new chance for this transatlantic trade agreement. At the same time, we are focusing on how we together can make a difference and leverage each other towards China. But when, as an export nation, as Germany is, it's different to the US. When at the same time your trade relation with the two biggest partners, the US and China, are under fire, and the one who is actually much closer to you doesn't send any signal that this will be fixed to the benefit of both sides, it's not easy to have a hard stance on the other side.
Absolutely. Let me now turn to, there's a member of our audience, Stephen Keenan, who has a quick question. I know we have very few minutes left, but Stephen, please go ahead.
Is that good now? Can you hear me, Andrea?
Yes, thank you.
Minister Jens Spahn, thank you so much for this opportunity. When I worked inside Afghanistan during the Cold War, and by the way, I haven't been to Berlin since I had to walk through Checkpoint Charlie after overextending my visa inside East Berlin. So I look forward to seeing Berlin now that it's one big city. It must be amazing. My experience in Afghanistan was that Germany was doing some of the best development in Afghanistan. How do you feel we should proceed with Afghanistan? And on a side note, how do you feel about Nord Stream 2? Thank you.
Great question. And maybe the GTZ and Germany's work and development more generally. Thank you, Spahn.
Well, first of all, you're always welcome in Berlin. Would be great with that history, actually, you have to tell, if you made it back here to Berlin and just see this city that really has developed since your last time here. On Nord Stream 2, I already have made my point today. On Afghanistan, I found it very important that, generally spoken, we find a common approach to this, and the way we went in together after 9/11, went in together as good allies with each other, helping each other, supporting each other, and now we should manage the way out together too, and in a way that does not leave a signal. I mean, I'm too young for that, but I know the pictures of the Soviets leaving Afghanistan, and I don't want to give the same impression as the Soviets did back then. So the way we handle this together, of course, we can't stay there forever, but the way we do it and the way we made it possible for the Afghans to manage themselves as good as possible, and that brings us back to the work of the GTZ and other civil players, and of course of the work of building up. I was in Afghanistan, I don't know, 4 or 5 times, visiting our troops there and seeing the work they do to teach the Afghan army, for example, and the police together with our allies. And what I find important is all the people, and the US has even lost more soldiers than we have, that we should leave more than chaos there for actually just to honor all the sacrifices that were made. And so that all we ask for is actually to do this in a coordinated way, and in a way that leaves perspective and not chaos.
Thank you. It's become a very complicated issue, as you know, in the US presidential transition.
I know.
I'll ask you a very quick one that's on everyone's mind. Most of my Stanford students don't remember any chancellor other than Angela Merkel in Germany. Who's going to be next?
Well, I do remember too, Helmut Kohl and Angela Merkel, but well, one thing is for sure, that will be a big change next year for Germany, for international politics, and for my party, for our party. I have I'm the same one as Angela Merkel. So actually, that will be a real change at the beginning of the new decade. I can't tell you who's next, but I can tell you that I will put all my efforts in that the next one is one of my party.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Herr Spahn, vielen Dank. Wir wissen, dass es spät für Sie ist. Und wir gratulieren, dass Deutschland so gut mit dem ganzen Coronavirus steht. Und wir freuen uns, Sie nochmal hier willkommen zu heißen.
Dankeschön. Thank you very much. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you to all of our audience. I'll just say that our next program will take place on Thursday, December 10th from 7 to 8 p.m. and will feature the Foreign Minister of South Korea in conversation with our Executive Director, Nick Burns. Thank you all for tuning in, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving.